He arrived at dusk with a polished doctor's bag and a name already praised in the Illinois papers. The great Chicago fire had left a trail of ash and orphans, and he came dressed as a man of mercy, tall, proper, carrying himself with the quiet authority of science and salvation. The coachman said little as he disembarked, but the townspeople saw a figure to admire. His eyes were calm, too calm, as if they had been trained to betray nothing. That was his first mask, the one he would wear so convincingly that even those who suspected unease kept silent. The orphanage stood at the edge of town, its wooden beams dark against the dying light. A home for children without homes, soon to be a place where order was praised. But mercy vanished. He walked its halls that night, touching walls, listening to echoes as if he was already measuring the building for something other than care. The newspapers called him a reformer. They said he brought discipline where chaos reigned, that he would save young lives from the streets. He accepted their words like offerings, smiling in photographs that made his hands look steady and pure. In private, he opened his bag and arranged its tools in perfect lines, not for healing but for study. To him, the children were not souls to be comforted but vessels, pliable and silent if broken correctly. He believed cruelty was not failure but progress, that suffering revealed truth the way flame revealed metal. This thought clung to him like a gospel, though he never spoke it aloud. Instead, he told the board he would begin with posture, with discipline, with making the orphans stand straight as citizens. The town nodded. Straight backs meant upright morals. No one asked what it meant for a child's spine to be forced into obedience. The first week he built frames of wood and leather straps. Children were placed inside, told it would make them strong. They trembled but obeyed. Hours passed and their legs shook under the strain. The straps cut into flesh, leaving raw grooves that deepened each day. When one girl collapsed, her frame held her upright, her head slumped but body nailed into position. They thought she slept. By dawn, she was still there, eyes open, her face locked in rigid peace. He wrote in his ledger that her endurance had failed. The body was removed before breakfast. The children saw, but no one spoke. He had already taught them silence. At night he walked the halls with a lantern, whispering prayers not to God, but to order itself. He believed that children were clay, that pain was the fire that hardened them into shape. The older ones sensed something beneath his calm, something colder than discipline. When one boy whispered to a matron that he feared the doctor, she hushed him quickly. The doctor was their patron, their savior, their shield from the streets. To question him was to question the town's own gratitude. So the boy swallowed his fear, and the silence spread like smoke in their lungs. He knew silence was his first victory. He built a small room near the cellar, plastering its walls thick enough to trap sound. Those who whimpered in the frames were placed there as punishment, given only salt water to drink. Days inside broke their voices. Some came out unable to speak above a whisper. One boy scratched his name into the wall with his nails, each letter drawn in blood. When he was carried out, limp and still, the name remained. The doctor ran his fingers over the marks and smiled, recording the length of survival with clinical precision. To him, death was not loss, it was data. The town still admired him. They saw children walking straighter, quieter, more orderly. They thought this discipline was proof of his promise. He allowed them to see only what confirmed their belief, parading the healthier ones at church gatherings, their collars buttoned tight, their smiles rehearsed. Behind them, the weaker children disappeared, replaced by graves without names or bodies burned before dawn. No ledger of the dead was kept. Only the doctor's private notes remained, filled with numbers, times, and a chilling satisfaction that progress was being made. He knew how to mask his hunger. He spoke of charity, of God's will, of scientific advancement. He wrote letters to patrons in Chicago, thanking them for donations that fed not stomachs, but his experiments. Each death became a private liturgy. He told himself he was perfecting discipline, purging weakness, shaping the future. In truth, he was testing the limits of flesh against silence, posture against pain, obedience against terror. He wanted to see how far the human body could bend before it broke, and when it broke, he wanted to see what remained. The children learned not to resist. Some stared at the floor whenever he passed, afraid their gaze would invite his attention. Others tried to disappear into corners, only to be pulled back into the center by his calm hand. His voice was never raised. He never struck them with rage. That was part of the horror. He acted not as a man punishing, but as a scientist measuring, as if their cries were not screams but instruments of study. To him, the orphanage was not a home. It was a chamber, a crucible, a place where human weakness could be exposed and catalogued. By winter, the air in the orphanage had changed. It no longer carried the sound of laughter or even sobbing. It carried a weighted hush, heavy as stone. The doctor walked with measured steps, a lantern always in hand, and the children held their breath when its glow touched their doors. Order had been achieved, but it was not order of safety. It was the order of fear, the stillness of prey when the predator moves. To the town, the orphanage seemed peaceful at last. To those inside, dusk meant the return of the lantern and the man who carried it, and with him the first shadows of cruelty that would never leave. The doctor began his work quietly, with the steady patience of a man who believed cruelty was progress if framed as discipline. He told the board that children bent by the hardship of poverty needed correction, not pity. And he built the instruments himself. Wooden frames, smooth at first glance, fitted with straps of leather and iron nails, stood lined against the wall like crude coffins left open. He called them posture braces, explaining they would teach the orphans to stand tall, straight-backed, ready for the future. The townsfolk accepted his words without question. Straight posture meant health, strength, civility. They did not ask what happened to a child who could no longer stand once the straps cut too deep. The first to enter was a boy of 8, shoulders hunched from labor in the fields before the fire left him parentless. The doctor adjusted the leather bands around the child's arms, pulling until his back arched painfully. He measured angles with a ruler as if studying an experiment and noted every wince and tremor. The boy lasted an hour before collapsing, but the frame held him upright, suspended like a puppet. His screams grew hoarse, then broke into shallow sobs. When finally released, he fell to the floor, his arm striped with raw welts where the straps had bitten in. The doctor wrote in his ledger that endurance time was 63 minutes. That night the boy was put to bed without supper, told this was for his own improvement. He did not wake the next morning. The matron whispered it was fever, though she knew the bruises told another story. The body was taken quickly, buried with no ceremony. The doctor assured them loss was inevitable with children already weakened by hunger. He said their sacrifice honored the pursuit of health. He said this as calmly as one would explain broken tools in a workshop. His words carried weight, and the town accepted them, for to question him meant admitting they had placed their children in the hands of a man who did not see them as children at all. The experiments continued. Day after day, small bodies were strapped into the frames. Some cried for mercy, some went limp almost at once. Others clenched their jaws and endured until their eyes rolled back in fainting silence. The doctor recorded every detail, the swelling of joints, the time until collapse, the effect of hunger on stamina. His pen scratched across the page like a prayer to order. He believed he was building something greater than medicine. He believed he was crafting obedience itself. Weeks passed and bruises became common, explained away as accidents from play. Yet whispers grew. Children vanished from their beds, their names quietly scratched off rosters. When one girl failed to appear at morning prayers, the matrons searched in silence. They found her in the hall where the frame stood. She was still bound inside, nailed upright through the wood itself. Her eyes were open, skin waxen, her head tilted as if she were a statue carved to represent perfect posture. The doctor ordered her, removed before the others could see, but some had already witnessed it, their small faces frozen in horror. That night the orphanage carried a hush deeper than ever before. The children huddled together in beds, whispering about frames that stole breath, about the doctor's calm eyes as he tightened straps. They wondered if obedience meant death, if silence was their only defense. No one dared speak to the matrons, for the matrons themselves were bound by fear. They had seen the girl nailed like wood to wood, but the doctor's word carried authority greater than truth. To accuse him would be to accuse science, progress, and the wealthy board that funded his work. So they said nothing, and their silence became another tool in his hands. The doctor felt no remorse. In his mind, death was not failure but revelation. Each child who perished proved the frailty of disobedience, the weakness of undisciplined flesh. He wrote letters to patrons describing his methods in careful language, speaking of correction and posture, never of screams or blood. He compared his work to the training of soldiers, to the reform of criminals, claiming children could be forged like iron if fire and pressure were applied. The wealthy applauded him from afar, sending more funds, praising his dedication. They never asked for proof beyond his words. Inside the orphanage, fear became the air they breathed. Children no longer slouched, not from health, but from terror of the frames waiting in the hall. Every movement grew stiff, every glance downward. They walked as if their bodies already belonged to the doctor's instruments. Nights grew longer, shadows stretched, and the lantern in his hand cast lines across the walls like bars of a cage. He watched them with the same detached interest one gives to animals under experiment. Each flinch, each forced smile, each trembling step was another piece of data for his ledger. When the second child was found lifeless, lips blue and wrists rubbed raw from straps, the doctor said it was weakness of constitution. He promised the survivors would grow stronger through continued correction. And so the cycle deepened. More frames were built, more names disappeared, and the orphanage became a silent factory of obedience, its product not healthy children but broken bodies and shattered minds. What lingered most was the statue of the girl, preserved in memory even after her body was buried. The children who saw her never forgot the way she stood, nailed upright as if discipline itself had consumed her. To them, she was not gone. She was still there, haunting every glance toward the frames, reminding them of what awaited if they faltered. And in that haunting silence, the doctor smiled, believing his work had only just begun. The doctor understood that pain was not enough. Pain could bend a child, but silence could break them. He began to build a room beneath the orphanage, a chamber of thick plaster walls that swallowed sound until even screams seemed to vanish. To the matrons, he called it the reflection room, a place where children could think on their disobedience. In truth, it was a coffin made of stone designed to study what happened when voices were stripped away. He furnished it with nothing but a bucket of salt water, a thin straw mat, and a door that locked with a single iron bolt. He believed silence was the purest form of discipline, that in silence the body gave up everything but obedience. The first child sent inside had been caught whispering of the girl nailed in her frame. He was only 7, frail but clever, his eyes still bright with questions. The doctor told him he would learn peace in the room. The boy lasted one night before his cries echoed faintly through the floorboards. By morning they were softer, broken by coughs. The salt water scalded his throat and thirst drove him to drink again, each swallow turning his mouth into an open wound. On the 3rd day the cries fell into rasping gasps. When the door opened, the boy staggered out, lips white, voice gone. He could no longer form words, only hisses of air. The doctor watched with satisfaction, noting how silence had carved obedience deeper than straps ever could. The experiment grew. More children were chosen, sent below for offenses as small as looking away during prayer or slouching at the table. Each returned diminished, their voices cracked or absent altogether. They moved like shadows now, obeying commands without question, their silence more chilling than screams had ever been. The orphanage became a hall of whispers cut short, as though sound itself had been bled from their throats. To the doctor, it was proof that silence was stronger than pain. Pain healed, silence remained. One boy resisted longer than the others. Older, nearly 12, he had seen his parents die in the fire and carried a stubborn will. Locked in the plaster cell, he refused to drink the salt water, refused to beg for release. For days the doctor listened, waiting. At last he heard the scratching. The boy had taken his own fingernails to the wall, dragging them until blood marked stone. Slowly, painfully, he carved his name letter by letter, each stroke leaving fragments of flesh behind. When his body was found slumped at the base of the wall, the word remained. A name written in blood and dust, the last defiance of a child who would not vanish in silence. The doctor examined it coldly, recording how long willpower endured when voice and body were starved together. He ordered the wall left untouched. To him, the boy's carved name was not a protest, it was data. For the children who survived, the silence became ritual. They no longer dared to speak at night, no longer whispered even in games. Eyes replaced voices, gestures replaced words. The building itself grew heavier, filled with a stillness that suffocated. Even the matrons found themselves whispering less, caught in the doctor's web of quiet. It was as though the room had bled into every corner, spreading its disease of silence throughout the orphanage. The doctor walked among them with calm pride, lantern casting shadows across children who sat straight and voiceless, their obedience perfect, their spirits hollow. He told himself he had created art. Silence was his masterpiece. The deaths continued. Some children never left the room, their bodies carried out stiff and pale, mouths crusted with salt. He marked their passing as necessary steps, failures of constitution. Others emerged alive but broken, never speaking again, eyes glazed, their small frames trembling whenever the doctor's lantern appeared. The orphans understood the message. To speak was to risk the room. To cry was to invite silence forever. They carried the weight of it like chains, chains invisible yet heavier than iron. The town noticed nothing. At Sunday services, the doctor presented neat rows of silent children, their backs straight, their eyes downcast. The congregation called them reverent, praised their discipline, thanked the doctor for instilling such respect. They clapped his back and offered donations, never asking why their eyes seemed empty, why no child sang the hymns anymore. Silence to them looked like holiness. Silence to him was proof of his genius. Yet the children whispered in their minds, whispering only to themselves. They remembered the boy who had scratched his name into stone, remembered the sound of nails dragging until blood smeared the wall. They knew silence was not just punishment. It was death stretched thin over days. And still they could not resist, for resistance was met with the bolt sliding shut and the walls pressing in, the hunger of silence waiting to devour them. The doctor's satisfaction grew. He began to think of silence not as a tool but as a contagion, something he could spread beyond the orphanage. He dreamed of reformatories and prisons filled with mute inmates, schools where children moved in orderly quiet, nations disciplined into voiceless obedience. His lantern glowed brighter each night as he walked the hallways, hearing not a cry, not a whisper, only the deep silence of fear that he had crafted with his own hands. In his mind, he was not a monster. He was a pioneer. By winter, the orphanage was no longer a home but a mausoleum. Laughter had been erased. Speech had been stolen. The children were living statues, shaped by hunger and silence, their humanity consumed in the service of one man's obsession. And yet he saw beauty in it, beauty in the hollow eyes, beauty in the stillness, beauty in the silence that could not be broken even by death. The walls of the punishment room held not just the voices of the dead, but the blueprint of his art, an art that promised to outlast them all. When silence had been perfected, the doctor sought another frontier of obedience. He turned to the nights when fear was most tender and the walls seemed to breathe with shadows. He carried his lantern as always, but now its light was no longer a symbol of order. It became the weapon. He called them light trials, rituals in which children were forced to sit in the glow until their eyes surrendered. At first, he made them stand in rows, staring into the flame while he timed their endurance. Minutes stretched into hours, and the heat of the lantern scorched their faces. Some tried to blink away the burn, others squeezed their eyes shut, but each was punished until eyelids opened again, the light cutting into their sight like a blade. The children learned quickly that disobedience meant the chair. It was a crude construction of wood and iron straps placed at the center of the hall. Once bound, the child's head was forced still and their eyelids were pulled wide with fish hooks tied to cords. The flame was positioned inches away, so close that their tears sizzled on their cheeks. They were told to hold their gaze steady, to worship the light as if it were truth itself, but truth in this chamber was only pain. Their eyes reddened, then clouded, some bursting small vessels until the whites ran red. Hours later, some were released half-blind, stumbling into darkness where once they had feared shadows but now could no longer escape them. Others collapsed in the chair, twitching until they went still, their eyes burned to nothing more than glazed stones. The doctor kept records of each trial, carefully writing down the stages of collapse. He believed that light stripped away deceit, that to stare into it was to prove loyalty to order. In his mind, he was burning out rebellion itself, cauterizing it at the root. He never raised his voice, never cursed. His cruelty was calm, ritualized, wrapped in the language of science and salvation. He would pace slowly, lantern swaying, as if conducting a ceremony no one else could understand. The children began to call it the Lantern March, for they knew wherever the glow fell, suffering followed. Whispers spread in the dormitories. They spoke of children whose eyes had turned white as milk, who stumbled against walls until they vanished altogether. Some said the furnace below had become a grave, its mouth swallowing their bodies with no prayers spoken. The matrons knew, though they never admitted it. They carried the bodies quietly at night, dragging them down corridors still haunted by the faint smell of scorched skin and oil. When the fires roared, the children covered their ears, but they could not block the thought that each crackling spark was a voice extinguished forever. One boy endured longer than the others. He fixed his gaze on the flame for hours, teeth clenched, refusing to break. The doctor grew curious, leaning close to watch as the boy's tears streamed down, catching in the hooks that held his lids apart. The boy whispered something under his breath, though his voice was too faint to hear. The doctor leaned closer, only to realize the boy was repeating his own name over and over, using it as a shield. Furious at the intrusion of will, the doctor ordered the flame drawn closer. The boy's eyes blistered, the skin of his face cracked, and finally he fell silent, his head lolling as smoke rose faintly from his lashes. The doctor recorded it as resistance time exceeded expectation. He made no note of the name. Those who survived carried their blindness as both punishment and warning. Children learned to walk softly, never looking directly at the lantern, never drawing attention. They moved through corridors that seemed alive with unseen presences. Some swore they saw shapes moving in corners, the outlines of those burned away, their shadows still walking long after their bodies had turned to ash. The orphanage became not just silent but haunted by light itself. Darkness was no longer what they feared. It was the glow of the lantern that made them tremble. For the doctor, this was proof of triumph. Silence had shaped their voices, the frames had bent their bodies, and now the lantern stripped their sight. He had taken sound, form, and vision, and reduced children to fragments of obedience. In his eyes, he was building purity. To others, if they had dared to look closely, he was dismantling humanity piece by piece. But none looked. The town praised the orphanage for its order, for the calm demeanor of its children, never knowing that calm was born of fire and hooks. At night, the hallways glowed faintly with lantern light, flickering in ways no single flame should. The children whispered in their heads that the dead had not left, that their shadows clung to the walls, unable to pass on. They believed the orphanage itself had absorbed their suffering. The plaster drinking screams, the beams drinking fire, the corridors lined with invisible eyes that had once been their own. And each evening, when the doctor raised his lantern and called for another trial, they stepped forward in silence, knowing resistance would only mean the chair, the hooks, and the flame. The furnace never cooled. Its smoke rose steady into the night sky, a silent signal to anyone who cared to notice. But no one asked why it burned so often, why the light inside the orphanage never went out. The doctor's shadow lengthened, stretching down halls where children no longer looked, where voices no longer spoke, where eyes no longer saw. The lantern rituals had become the rhythm of their nights, a rhythm of torture disguised as order, and beneath it the doctor smiled, convinced that light itself had made him the master of silence. The doctor had always spoken as if his work was larger than the orphanage walls, but now he made it true. By candlelight he wrote letters, his script steady and neat, addressed not only to his patrons in Chicago but across the ocean. To men who dined in London clubs and served in Queen Victoria's court. He called himself a reformer, a man advancing modern correction, aligning his experiments with the codes and laws of Europe. He reminded them of the Queen's fascination with science, of her interest in discipline and order, and he painted himself as her loyal servant in the American wilderness, a physician carrying forward the torch of reason where chaos had once reigned. In his words, the children became subjects of study, not names or souls. He described their silence as proof of progress, their rigid posture as evidence of moral rebirth. He did not write of hooks or flames or the muffled screams inside plaster walls. Instead, he spoke of trials, of endurance tests, of measurable data that could shape a generation of obedient citizens. He wrapped horror in the language of reform, and across the sea men nodded approvingly, convinced that his orphanage was a laboratory for the future. They sent him funds, gold folded into envelopes, letters of praise that spoke of noble purpose. In their ignorance, or perhaps their willful blindness, they gave him the very fuel his cruelty needed. The money changed the orphanage. No longer did he work with crude wooden frames. He hired carpenters to fashion iron braces, instruments that tightened with screws instead of leather straps. He ordered glass lenses shipped from Europe, magnifying flames into brighter torments for the lantern rituals. He brought in chemicals, powders, tinctures, each used not to heal but to sharpen suffering into something precise. With every donation he built not safety but refinement. His cruelty became polished, deliberate, methodical, each death no longer hidden but catalogued like a published paper. When a child collapsed in the frames, their body twisted and broken, he no longer called it weakness. He called it demonstration. He summoned the matrons to observe, forcing them to watch as small bones cracked under pressure, then insisting they record the results in ledgers alongside him. Some wept, but their tears meant nothing. He said it was education. He said it was the Queen's will, that in serving him they were serving her. The weight of royalty silenced their doubts. None dared accuse him when he spoke with the crown as his shield. The children felt the shift. Where once their deaths were explained away as fever, now they were public, performed like lessons. He gathered them in the hall, ordering them to watch as one of their own was bound to the chair. Eyelids hooked wide, flame pressed close until the face sagged like wax. When the body slumped, he did not hurry it away. He lectured calm and measured about endurance, about the dangers of weakness, about the purity of obedience. Their fear was no longer an accident. It was the point. He carved dread into them as carefully as he carved notes into his ledger. Those who survived began to see themselves not as children but as specimens. They whispered no more, for silence was demanded. They wept no more, for tears brought attention. They tried to vanish into shadows, but even shadows were no refuge, for he claimed the very darkness belonged to him. Their minds bent inward, trapped in loops of fear, each heartbeat counting time until their own demonstration arrived. Some grew numb, watching others burn or break with eyes as empty as stone. That was his triumph. Not only the deaths, but the hollowing of the living into ghosts who waited. The letters continued. He wrote of his successes, of the precision of his data, of his vision for institutions across America modeled on his work. He spoke of silence as discipline, of light as truth, of posture as morality. His words dripped with pride, yet nowhere did he mention the blood under his fingernails, the ash that filled his lungs from the furnace that never cooled. The nobles read his reports and saw progress. They sent more money, praising his devotion to science, never asking why so many graves were dug behind the orphanage, why smoke rose so often from its chimney. Each new death was logged not as tragedy but as proof. He wrote the times, the conditions, the precise moment breath ceased. To him, the orphanage had become a laboratory more advanced than any university, because here he could control everything: sound, sight, body, mind. He was not healing. He was remaking humanity according to his design, and he believed the Queen herself would admire his resolve. The children felt that belief like a curse. They knew their suffering was no longer hidden, but sanctioned. That each scream, each collapse, each charred body fed not only his hunger but the pride of men oceans away. Their torment had become spectacle, their deaths reduced to sentences written in clean ink on fine paper. Even the matrons, trapped in their obedience, began to feel the weight of it pressing on their minds. Some prayed for the doctor to falter, to grow careless, to meet the fire himself. Yet he walked calm as ever, lantern in hand, confident that the crown and the church alike stood behind him. By spring, the orphanage was transformed. The walls still carried silence, the corridors still reeked of smoke, but now the cruelty had been sharpened into ritual. No child died by chance. Each was chosen, prepared, broken with purpose. Each death was not hidden but shaped into a demonstration of obedience. And in the doctor's calm eyes, each one was a step forward, proof that his art of discipline was worthy of queens and kings. The furnace had always burned in the belly of the orphanage, its smoke rising steady into the night like a signal no one wanted to read. At first it had been for heat, a comfort against Illinois winters, but under the doctor's hand it became something else entirely. He told the matrons that fire was the ultimate teacher, that flame purified where words and rods failed. The Queen's men had sent him money for refinement, and he spent it on iron, on chains, on instruments that could withstand the heat of the furnace without giving way. Soon the children learned to fear the sound of coals being shoveled, for it meant another trial, another body brought to the mouth of the fire. He called them fire tests, and he spoke of them with the same calm he used when discussing posture or silence. The children were bound to iron chairs, their wrists and ankles clasped tight so they could not move. The chair was rolled close to the furnace door, its heat spilling out in waves that scorched skin and seared lungs. At first they coughed, their small chests heaving, but the doctor would not allow release. He measured the minutes, watching as lips cracked, as eyes watered, as gasps turned to choking. The smoke crawled down their throats, blistering lungs until each breath was agony. Some fainted within moments, collapsing against the iron straps, while others clung to life, twitching, eyes wild as their bodies betrayed them. He noted endurance in his ledger with precise times, recording every death as if it were no more than a failed experiment. The screams rose into the rafters, echoing through the orphanage. Children covered their ears in the dormitories, but the sound seeped in like the smoke itself. They could not escape it. Some whispered prayers into their blankets, others pressed fists into their mouths to stifle sobs. Yet silence was demanded, and so they endured, knowing each cry they let slip might draw the lantern's light to their bed next. The torture of the fire was not just in the furnace room. It spread through the building, lodging in every child's chest a shared fear that never cooled. The doctor added new refinements. Branding irons heated in the coals until they glowed red were pressed into flesh in the shape of crosses. He told himself it was a lesson in devotion, that each mark was a seal of purity. The children screamed, their skin blistering as the iron hissed against them, the smell of burning flesh filling the chamber. Some survived, carrying the cross scar for the rest of their short lives, flinching whenever cloth brushed the wound. Others went limp, their bodies unable to endure the searing pain. They were dragged away, discarded like broken wood, while the doctor calmly wrote in his book, "Failed at 7 minutes, failed at 12. He never wrote their names, only the numbers, as if their humanity had burned away with their skin. The matrons tried to avert their eyes, but he forced them to watch, claiming their witness was necessary to the work. He told them they served not him but the queen, that science demanded their presence. Some wept silently, their hands trembling as they scrubbed blood from iron straps. But none dared resist. His authority was absolute, shielded by letters and gold from overseas. They were as trapped as the children, bound by chains no less real for being unseen. For the children, the fire tests became legend, whispered only in the safest corners. They spoke of the furnace as if it were alive, a beast that devoured voices and spit out smoke. Some believed the souls of those burned within it lingered, clinging to the rafters, their cries forever woven into the crackle of flames. They swore that even when the fire cooled, the sound of screams could still be heard if one pressed an ear to the walls. And yet, despite their terror, they obeyed. For obedience was the only shield left to them, thin though it was. One boy resisted differently. Dragged to the iron chair, he refused to scream. The heat blistered his skin, the smoke clawed his lungs, but he clenched his jaw, glaring at the doctor with eyes filled not with fear but defiance. Minutes stretched into what felt like eternity. The doctor grew fascinated, leaning close to watch as the child's lips cracked open, blood mixing with soot. Still the boy made no sound. At last his body convulsed, his chest heaved, and he fell silent forever, slumped against the straps. The doctor wrote endurance, exceptional. He smiled as if satisfied by art. But the children who witnessed whispered his name afterward. Not with fear, but reverence, as if his silence had planted a seed of rebellion no fire could consume. The furnace never rested. Its chimney spat smoke day and night, and still the town asked no questions. They told themselves the orphanage was warm because of the doctor's generosity, that the fire was only proof of his care. None wondered why the smell of burned flesh sometimes drifted on the wind. None dared to look too closely at the children's hollow eyes or the fresh scars shaped like crosses beneath their collars. Silence protected them as much as it condemned them. The doctor, meanwhile, grew convinced he had achieved mastery. He had taken sound, sight, and now breath itself, bending them all to his will. He told himself he was not cruel but scientific, that each child lost was a step toward purer order. His ledgers thickened with numbers, his methods sharpened, and his pride swelled with every body dragged from the furnace mouth. To him, fire was not death. It was truth, the purest truth he could give. And so the chimney rose each night against the sky, smoke curling like a dark hymn, bearing witness to an orphanage where fire itself had become the teacher. The children breathed it in even in their sleep, and knew there was no corner untouched by its reach. The furnace had become the heart of the orphanage, and its beat was death. The fire had taught him about lungs, about how smoke stripped breath and heat broke will. But he was not content. To the doctor, cruelty was never an end. It was a ladder, each rung another experiment to prove that obedience could be perfected. When the furnace cooled, he turned his attention below. The orphanage cellar, damp and unused, became his next chamber. He ordered it cleared, its earth dug deeper, its stone walls sealed with plaster. Then he opened the pipes and let water flow in until it rose waist-high, dark and stagnant, carrying the chill of the ground itself. He called it a cleansing chamber, but in truth it was a shrine to rot, designed to test how long flesh could resist decay when the mind was trapped in terror. Children were dragged down in small groups, chained to iron rings hammered into the walls. Their wrists and ankles were bound, keeping them upright in the water, their bodies trembling as the cold gnawed at them. At first they cried, begging for release, their voices echoing against the damp walls. But as hours passed, their teeth chattered so violently they could not form words. The water leached heat from their bones, leaving lips blue and skin pale as wax. The doctor stood at the stairs, lantern in hand, timing their endurance as calmly as if he were taking a pulse. He measured the color of their lips, the slowness of their breath, the moment when shivering gave way to stillness. Each note was written in his ledger, another line of proof that fear and cold together could carve obedience deeper than fire or silence. Some children survived the first night, dragged out at dawn, their bodies so stiff they could barely walk. They were put to bed without blankets, forced to warm themselves with their own trembling flesh. They carried the cellar with them, every joint aching, every breath haunted by the thought of water rising higher. Others did not wake. Their heads had slumped forward as exhaustion overtook them, their mouths dipping below the surface. In the morning light, their bodies floated slack against the chains, hair drifting like weeds in a pond. The doctor recorded their times with satisfaction. Drowning to him was not failure, it was data, another measurement in his long catalog of human breaking points. There were worse discoveries still. Some children remained upright even in death, their chains holding them against the wall, eyes frozen open as if still waiting for release. Their skin turned gray, bloated by the water, but their expressions remained strangely calm, as if obedience had followed them into death itself. The survivors who saw them screamed until their throats broke. They swore the dead were still watching, waiting, their eyes fixed on the door as if demanding witnesses to their suffering. The doctor, unmoved, ordered the bodies left for hours before removal, believing the living needed to see what disobedience or weakness cost. In his mind, each corpse was a sermon. The cellar grew foul with the stench of mildew and rot. The water itself became tainted, carrying the filth of decay from one trial to the next. Skin infections spread among the children, sores blooming across their bodies, but the doctor saw this not as illness, but as opportunity. He documented how long wounds festered, how the flesh softened in water, how disease weakened spirit. He believed the cellar proved his greatest truth, that nature itself conspired with him, that water and cold joined his cause of discipline. He did not call it torture, he called it communion. The matrons forced to accompany him grew pale with fear. Some tried to plead for mercy, insisting the children would die in such conditions. But he silenced them with the same calm words he always used. He spoke of progress, of the Queen's interest in science, of the need for strong bodies and stronger wills. He reminded them that the funds supporting the orphanage came from men who expected results, not pity. To resist him was to resist the future, and so the matrons lowered their eyes, their complicity cemented by silence. They carried out the bodies without protest, washing the stone walls with trembling hands, all the while knowing the water would soon rise again. The children spoke of the cellar only in whispers. They called it the drowned chapel, for it felt like a church where prayers went unanswered and the only hymns were the splashes of chains against water. Some said the souls of the drowned remained there, trapped in the dark, their whispers bubbling up from beneath the surface. They swore they felt cold hands brush against their legs when they were lowered in, as if the dead themselves clung to the living, pulling them down to join their ranks. Sleep became impossible for those who survived, every dream filled with water rushing in, every nightmare ending with lungs bursting in silence. The doctor did not dream, he only planned. To him, the cellar was proof of what he had always believed, that suffering could be shaped into a tool sharper than any blade. Fire had taught him breath, silence had taught him will, and now water taught him endurance. He imagined prisons filled with cells like his, armies trained not with rifles but with chains and cold. He believed he was not breaking children but building the future. A future where obedience was etched into the very marrow of mankind. Yet even in his triumph, the orphanage began to change in ways he did not expect. The halls grew damp, the air heavy with mildew, and the sound of dripping water echoed where none should be. Children whispered that the orphanage itself was drowning, that the walls held the cries of those who had perished below. Lantern light flickered strangely in the corridors, as if bent by unseen water. Some claimed to see reflections of themselves in puddles where none should exist, reflections with eyes wide and mouths open, waiting. The cellar had become more than a chamber. It had become a presence, a shrine built not only of stone and water but of fear itself. And so the doctor walked each night with his lantern, marking the times, recording the deaths, convinced he had mastered yet another frontier of obedience. But the children, hollow-eyed and trembling, knew the truth. The cellar was not a lesson. It was a graveyard that breathed, and every time the water rose, it whispered to them that sooner or later it would take them too. When word of his orphanage reached Chicago, the praise became louder, and with it came visitors. Wealthy patrons, clergymen, and officials traveled by carriage to see what order looked like in the ashes of a city still scarred by fire. They expected chaos, wild children, filth, and disarray. But what they found instead were neat halls and rows of silent faces. The doctor welcomed them with polite bows, his voice calm, his steps deliberate, the lantern always in his hand as if to guide them. He spoke of discipline, of science, of the promise of reform. The visitors smiled, congratulating him for his work, marveling at children who did not fidget or speak out of turn. Their eyes lingered on the cleanliness of the walls, never daring to look deeper into the cracks where rot and fear truly lived. For these occasions, the doctor paraded the healthiest children, those whose backs were still straight enough, whose eyes still clear enough to pass for normal. Their smiles were rehearsed, taught like hymns, each gesture carefully drilled until it could be performed without hesitation. They sang soft verses, they bowed their heads, they thanked the guests with trembling politeness. None of the visitors asked why their voices never carried joy, why their laughter sounded rehearsed, why not one of them ever spoke out of turn. They saw only obedience and mistook it for virtue. Behind closed doors, the truth festered. The weakest, the broken, the ones whose eyes had clouded or whose skin carried the scars of fire and frost were hidden away. Yet the doctor would not let them vanish quietly. He made them wear masks, grotesque creations fashioned from the very faces of the dead. With horsehair stitches and wax, he preserved expressions of obedience, eyes sewn open, lips fixed in rigid smiles. These masks were strapped to the living, forced upon trembling children whose own features no longer matched the doctor's vision of perfection. They were paraded in the halls at night, a grotesque theater of discipline, each movement a mockery of life. The children who wore them suffered beyond words. The masks pressed into their skin, suffocating them with the weight of death. Some clawed at the straps until their nails tore bloody, but the doctor restrained them, insisting they wear the masks until obedience took root. Their screams, muffled beneath horsehair and wax, sounded more like the cries of animals than children. When they collapsed, suffocating beneath the faces of those who had already perished, the doctor noted the time in his ledger. To him, even death in disguise was a lesson, another demonstration that the weak could be reshaped into symbols of order. The survivors were broken in different ways. They feared not only the lantern or the furnace, but the very sight of their dead peers. They whispered that the masks carried the souls of those lost, that the dead had returned to claim the living, forcing them into borrowed skin. They swore the stitched eyes followed them, that the fixed smiles twisted when no one else was watching. In their minds, the orphanage was no longer only a place of silence and smoke. It was a stage where the living were condemned to play the parts of the dead. These doctor's pride only grew. When visitors left, they carried glowing reports of his work, praising his order, his methods, his cleanliness. They did not see the cellar, the furnace, the frames, or the masks. They saw rows of quiet children and a doctor who spoke of progress with calm conviction. To them, he was proof that suffering could be tamed, that the wild chaos of poverty could be molded into civility. Their donations swelled, and his reputation spread farther than ever. He had mastered the art of presenting innocence while hiding horror, and he believed himself untouchable. Yet within the orphanage walls, dread deepened. Children no longer dreamed of escape. Instead, they dreamed of faces that were not their own, of masks pressed against them, of eyes stitched open that never closed. They avoided mirrors, afraid they might see not their own reflection, but the dead staring back. Some stopped speaking altogether, fearing their voices would betray them and earn the mask. Others begged silently with their eyes, pleading with matrons who could not protect them. The matrons themselves trembled, forced to strap masks onto children's faces with hands that shook so violently they could barely thread the cords. They carried the guilt like chains, knowing their complicity was sealing the children's fates. The doctor, however, saw none of this as cruelty. He saw it as art. In his mind, the masks were symbols of triumph, proof that he could bend not only the living but even the dead into tools of discipline. He believed he had discovered a new frontier, obedience beyond death, loyalty that outlived flesh. He told himself he had created immortality, a performance where the dead served as models for the living, their faces guiding generations yet to come. He never saw the terror in the children's eyes as anything more than weakness, never understood that their silence was not reverence, but despair. By the end of the season, more children had vanished into the earth, their bodies buried in shallow graves, their faces stolen for future masks. Those who survived carried the weight of borrowed smiles, their own identities eroded under the pressure of performance. The orphanage became a gallery of ghosts, each hallway lined not with portraits but with children who bore the faces of the dead. The visitors from Chicago never knew. They left convinced they had witnessed reform, carrying stories of cleanliness and order back to a city desperate for hope. But the children knew the truth. They knew the doctor's order was built not on life, but on death disguised as innocence. And as night fell, when the lantern's light flickered across masks that stared with stitched eyes, they understood that the orphanage itself was no longer a home. It was a stage where suffering performed in silence, and every child was both actor and audience, trapped in a play that never ended. By the autumn of 1872, the orphanage had become a husk filled with ghosts, its walls steeped in smoke, silence, and the weight of graves hidden beneath its soil. The doctor walked its halls with the same calm conviction as always, lantern in hand, ledger tucked beneath his arm, convinced his work was untouchable. But cruelty has a way of consuming even its architect, and the orphanage itself seemed to groan under the strain of so many deaths. The air carried the stench of rot and burnt flesh. The corridors echoed with whispers no one dared to voice. Children moved like shadows, hollow-eyed, their obedience perfect, their spirits shattered. The fire that came was not a surprise. To those who lived within, it felt like the inevitable conclusion, the final ritual in a house built on torment. It began in the dead of night. Flames rose first from the lower rooms, crawling hungrily along the wooden beams, but they did not move as ordinary fire does. Witnesses outside swore the blaze leapt unnaturally, as if drawn to the locked chambers where children still slept. Screams broke through the crackle of timbers, high and piercing, cutting across the silence the doctor had built with such care. Some children beat against doors that would not open, their fists breaking on iron latches. Others clung together, their thin bodies swallowed by smoke before the flames touched them. The fire spread faster than any could outrun. It seemed to know where the weak were hiding, finding them, devouring them, carrying their cries into the night sky. Neighbors rushed toward the orphanage, but the heat drove them back. Faces pressed against windows, mouths open in silent screams, eyes glowing with fire. Through the smoke, they swore they saw the lantern still moving, drifting through collapsing corridors. Some claimed the doctor stood in the upper hall, calm, lantern raised high as if guiding the blaze like a ritual. Whether he died in the fire or vanished into its smoke was never known. By dawn, the building was ash and ruin, beams collapsed, chimney still exhaling. Bodies lay fused together in heaps, some upright as if still obeying even in death, their scorched faces staring outward. Yet the horror did not die. Weeks after, neighbors whispered of strange lights flickering in the ruins, bobbing like lanterns where no hand carried them. Children avoided the sight, swearing the air itself watched. Farmers said the doctor's glow wandered their fields, searching for new victims. The chimney smoked through rain and snow, the scent of burning flesh carried on the wind. Survivors grew into adulthood marked by silence, their backs stiff, their voices broken, laws changed, orphanages forced to keep records, inspections demanded. But the lights still flickered at night, reminders that cruelty survives in silence, waiting to return. The story ends not with answers, but with reflection. Cruelty does not vanish with fire. It does not die when walls collapse. It lingers in silence, in respectability, in the calm voices of those who insist they only seek order. The orphanage is gone, its walls buried under flowers, its bones scattered to earth. And yet the lights still glow at night, flickering like lanterns in a house that no longer exists. What do you think? Could such silence return? Could cruelty wear the mask of reform again, hiding in plain sight until the fire comes once more?